Welcome, everyone, to this web stream panel discussion. My name is Gro Lindstad, and I am the Executive Director of Focus, Forum for Women and Development, headquartered here in Oslo, Norway. In 20 years, issues have emerged that were not a visible part of Women, Peace and Security agenda when the Security Council Resolution 1325 was passed in year 2000. With the development of national action plans and training of military forces, issues have come up, and deep-rooted attitudes need changing. Young women and youth in general need clear inclusion in all aspects of peace and security agenda. Extremism have become a part of the agenda in a way not visible 20 years ago. To ensure the intergenerational and intersectional approach to how we work and how we implement the various resolutions passed during these 20 years, we're picking up and we're linking discussions. To mark the 20th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, and to also capture discussions we now have and need to have more, Focus, Forum for Women and Development, together with the Peace and Research Center in Oslo, PRIO, and the University of Oslo, have invited 4 women to be part of an hour of discussion, giving us new perspectives and sharing their insights and knowledge. We will get into issues that in different ways also connect the discussions. I would like to start off by introducing Marie Doucy, who is with us on link from France. Marie is the Gender Responsive Peacebuilding Policy Specialist at UN Women. She is a former senior program officer at International IDEA and have also worked as a policy analyst with UNDP in Haiti. So, Marie, you have long experience in many ways, and you've also worked for the UN Peacebuilding Support Office as a focal point on youth, peace, and security and that agenda. And my question to you, opening up this discussion, is on the youth, peace, and security agenda. And the youth, peace, and security agenda has become visible. And now it also has its own resolution as part of the peace and security agenda. And I'm wondering, since you're well placed, how has this emerged in the past 20 years? And what does youth have to bring to the table?
Thank you very much, Gru, and thanks you. Good morning to everyone. I'm very honored to be in such a wonderful panel with talented women. I think it is great that we are picking up now the discussion on youth, peace, and security in the framework of the 20th anniversary of Women, Peace, and Security. So the youth, peace, and security agenda is often referred to as the little sister of WPS because it's much more recent. As you mentioned, the very first resolution on youth, peace, and security was voted by the Security Council in 2015. And it was quite groundbreaking resolution because for the very first time, the Security Council recognized the historic role of young people and their contribution to peace and security efforts. And the resolution called for action across 5 different pillars, calling for young people participation in peace and security, but also calling for increased protection of young women and men, for involving young people in conflict prevention efforts, calling for more partnership between different stakeholders to support young people, and also calling for action in the field of disengagement and reintegration of young people previously engaged with armed forces. Following that, we had two other resolutions on youth peace and security in 2018, and the latest over the summer, resolution 2535. But to respond to your question, how this emerged, even though the first resolution is quite recent, only 5 years ago, it is a deeply bottom-up agenda. So this agenda has been led by a coalition of civil society actors, by young peace builders themselves, working together with the UN and other international stakeholders to bring this agenda to the Security Council, asking the Security Council to finally recognize the work that they already have been doing in the ground for decades, recognizing that young people, young women and young men are very active and already at the forefront in the ground, leading social cohesion initiative. They are at the forefront of humanitarian action. And we are seeing it now more than ever in this very difficult year with the COVID-19 response. Young people lead response efforts, but also the lead change. We've seen it the last year with protest movements across the globe, from Chile to Sudan to Lebanon. Young people and young women specifically have been at the forefront of leading change. And this agenda is really about trying to shift the understanding of the role of young people, because policymakers and international actors for many years have tended to see young people, and especially young men, as a threat to peace and security, seeing young people and especially unemployed youth as the potential threat to peace and security, but also as naturally vulnerable of joining violent extremist groups. So youth was rather seen as a threat to be contained rather than chains. And the youth peace and security agenda is really about showing that we need to counter these policy myths and stereotypes. And if we invest in youth, if we nurture their efforts and contributions to peace and security, societies may actually reap peace dividends. So basically, in a nutshell, this is what youth can bring to the table, and very happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Marie, for giving us the kind of overall background to this and making us understand a little more, and those watching how how youth is important in the peace and security agenda, and to kind of get in more deeper into the specifics. I'm going to turn to another part of this panel. On stage with me, Andrea Ramirez Tangelan. You're a board member of Peace in Colombia, which is an organization here in Norway. You're an activist. You're a master's student currently in social anthropology at the University of Oslo. And you also work for the Norwegian People's Aid, and you worked for Focus. Your roots are also from Colombia. And you've followed the peace process in Colombia for a number of years, even though your young age. So I know you're dedicated to this, and I want to know if, have young people been actively involved in the struggle for peace in Colombia? And how are they working together with other actors in the process?
Thank you, Gro, and thank you for that kind introduction. Yes. Have youth been active in the peace process in Colombia? My God, yes, we have. Absolutely. This has been a process. The peace negotiations with the former FARC guerrilla were, in fact, they lasted for 4 years, but then 4 years ago, those were signed. So we're talking about 8 years. And that means a whole generation of youth have grown up in this environment of dinner table discussions around peace and the future of the country, about the problematics, about corruption and femicides and all these, climate change things we really need to address if we're going to build not just a more peaceful and equitable society, but a more democratic society as well. So, you know, one of the lead feminist and female journalists in Colombia, Maria Jimena Dusan, she was here in Oslo 2 years ago, and she said, we have a generation of peace. This new generation, this youth generation is a generation of peace. I found that so beautiful, and also it resonated very strongly. So in order to talk a little bit about, you know, how is it that is done, I would say one of the key things that youth in Colombia and elsewhere outside, you know, being here in Norway as well, we still support the peace process and all the efforts done there, especially by building bridges. And building bridges means, you know, building bridges amongst youth, indigenous youth, Afro-Colombian youth, more urban youth within the country, but also youth outside, like myself. We also try to build bridges between the, you know, the feminist tradition and the struggle for women's equity and LGBTQ, for example. So there is a number of bridge building projects, I would say, going on that are really, you know, fueling up under this momentum of change that we want to see, not just in Colombia. I would argue, you know, all over the world. Climate change is uniting youth as well, all over. And so, you know, I'll try to leave it there to keep the conversation going, but there is a lot going on, yeah.
Good. And I know that in your introduction, my head is spinning with a lot of follow-up questions. But before going on to that, I will also draw in Inger Skjelsbæk. You're one of the true pioneers of working on women, peace, and security research. You've done your PhD on sexual violence in time of war, sexuality, ethnicity, and gender diversity in the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I know you've been dedicated to this for long. Currently, you're a professor at the Center of Gender Research at the University of Oslo. And you've also had a prior job as the research director at PRIO. Now, you've also, I mean, moving on from your PhD, you've also done a lot of research on children and youth in conflict, and have been doing a lot of work to give more visibility to these groups. And connecting into both Marie and Andrea, what has your research shown, and what is important, do you think?
Thank you, Guro, for that nice introduction, and thanks for being part of, or being given the space to be part of this discussion here today. I think to go back to one of the initial things that you said, Guro, you know, we're taking stock, where are we at this particular point? And I have to say, as a researcher, also one really important thing that that we should be proud of and acknowledge is that women, peace, and security is now also a big knowledge field. It's not just, you know, not just politics and activism, but we're also having a very, very dedicated research community that focuses on many elements of the resolutions. And through that, we also get more overviews of research gaps. What is it that we don't know? And how do we not know things? So I want to acknowledge one important thing before I get to the issue of youth, which is that the focus that has been given to women's plight in war, the fact that women suffer from gender-based violence, in order to address that in whatever shape or form, from the NGO world, from the policy world or research world, someone has to stand up and say, this happened to me. And that's not an easy task. That's not easy to do. But we've had a number of women around the world who have said, these things happened to me, it was not right. It was sexual violence, for instance, is a crime of war. And through that comes a different way of talking about things that have been hidden, that traditionally have been privatized. So getting then to youth, children born of war is a group of children that we have not known much about, the research community. They have not been sufficiently addressed by policymakers, by NGO communities. It's a big knowledge and policy gap. But fortunately, I think now, because we talk about war experiences and gendered war experiences in different ways, these children who have been conceived either through violence, either through love relations, but are at risk of being stigmatized in the communities where they grow up, they are now placed in a situation where they can say, I am such a child, here is my voice. And we're seeing that many places now, that children conceived, for instance, through the war rapes in Bosnia, the war rapes in Rwanda, through violent relationships and also love relationships in Colombia and elsewhere in conflict zones, are speaking up at a very young age. And I think that we should applaud them for doing that. And I think that we should listen to what they have to say. Who are they in their communities? How are they perceived? And what are the gender dimensions of being a child of war? Is it different for a boy than a girl? Why is it so? And what can we do to address that? And I think as a researcher, I can only acknowledge that here is a big knowledge gap that I think that we will see a lot of research and engagement in the years to come. And it links to the Youth Peace and Security Agenda as well, the Women Peace and Security Agenda. And I think that there's a lot of learning to be had on many fronts in the coming years. Thanks to these very courageous children who are speaking up and letting the world know that they exist.
Thank you. And before moving on, I just want to say that I think that there's also challenges on civil society side, on actually women's organizations and others, including these young voices, and not just being, our generation who speak on behalf of women's organizations on the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, but let other voices be heard. And I'll get back to you on that also on Bosnia. But I want to pull in Lena Kvarving, who is in Vienna currently. Lena is a lieutenant colonel, and Lena has a PhD and has written about this gender perspective in the armed forces and military operation, an uphill battle, cultural, structural, and functional factors that prevent or promote implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in the Norwegian Armed Forces and NATO. Lena, you're currently working as a gender advisor, politico-military domain at OCE in Vienna. And you also have a long CV of other work you've done. We've had a discussion this morning, and I've asked questions to the Minister of Defense also on some of the findings of your thesis and your writings. My question to you to get us into this is, Norway's had a clear ambition to be leading internationally on issues connected to women, peace, and security. And while we do a lot through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on mediation and work at the UN and more, research shows that the Norwegian Armed Forces are not leading. And advice from the Military Committee at NATO is not being followed up as it should. Now, based on your research and your knowledge, could you let us know some of the reasons why this is not happening? And then I'll tie you in more to the intergenerational perspective in this as we go along. But I think this is important because so many young women are now also entering armed forces in Norway.
Absolutely, Gro. Thank you. I watched this morning's session, and when the Minister of Defense said that, at least I know that there's one leader in the armed forces that support this issue, and it's very important to him. And I'm thinking, that is great, the new Minister of Defense, Chief of Defense, but it's 20 years down the line. I mean, we should have done so much more already. So I'll tell you about some of the factors that prevent implementation in the armed forces. And first of all, it is, these leaders in the armed forces that have not educated themselves. on the topic. And when we know that change can be challenging, and without leaders that actually want to lead this transformational change that the Women, Peace and Security agenda aims for, and when they don't exercise their command and control in the armed forces, they're not going to be international beacons in this area. The defense staff never really conceptualized the national action plans and all the tasks that were given to the armed forces within those plans. So instead, they just told the rest of the organization, implement Resolution 1325. And the rest of the organization is like, implement what? It needs to be conceptualized and to show the aims and ambitions the armed forces want in this respect. There's also this hegemonic masculine organizational culture that favors hard security. And when issues connected to women, peace and security and equality is ridiculed, has low status, and you meet a lot of that kind of subtle opposition, it prevents progress. Combined with the leadership lack of, how can I say, positive vision of change and no reward and discipline system to support that change, that means there's no consequences for not solving the tasks. It becomes very, very challenging. Another factor that prevented implementation was that self-evaluation and self-reporting that we see a lot of. And when it seems to be enough to present things like a success, that it looks good, instead of making sure that it is a reality. The armed forces are excellent at public relations in Norway. The recruitment campaigns, the branding campaigns, they are awesome. They win awards. But neither the Ministry of Defense, the Audit General, nor the public have really held the armed forces accountable for actual implementation. They have not included, gender mainstreamed everything they do. They've not included gender perspectives in all their projects, policies, education, analysis, operations, exercises, and so on. They've not established necessary structures like gender advisors or gender focal points in the organization. And they've not developed and reinforced a professional academic environment for this topic and so on. So, and when the armed forces are not measured on these things or held accountable, it's just not going to be done. So plans remain plans, and the resolutions remain resolutions if implementation fails. So from my experience, the security organizations like NATO, the OSCE, where I'm now, the EU even, you would think that maybe they are slower with all the nations, coming together to make progress, but they're actually more advanced than the Norwegian armed forces in very many aspects. I've attended, several launches of the Norwegian national action plans in Norway, and I find that lack of, honesty and transparency to be a democratic challenge that no one is really taking responsibility for. As long as we get away with presenting ourselves as better than we are and it looks good, we're not going to progress the way we need it to be. So, and we also know that, we know who will pay the price for the lack of implementation of the Women, Peace and Security. And on that note, I think it's important also to ask that who might also contribute or benefit from upholding status quo as it is today.
Thank you, Lena, and I'll just follow up immediately with you because I talked to someone here this morning who was here from the armed forces, who said that there's a difference within the armed forces and those serving in operations in other countries are much more aware and take the Women, Peace and Security agenda into account when they are out, and when they come back home, than those who have never been out on operations. Is that something that you would agree on?
In general, yes, absolutely, because then you often see the need for it, wherever you're in operations. But I think it's so important to realize that in order to actually make a difference in operations, you need to be able to do it within your own organization. It's like, how are we as an armed forces going to be able to respond the correct way to sexual and gender-based violence in conflict areas if we're not able to deal with sexual and harassment within our own forces? That I know the Minister of Defense referred to earlier today. So we need to gender mainstream ourselves, our own organizations, in order to actually make a difference in operations. And those operations might as well be in the Norwegian territory and as in international environment.
Thank you. If I can pull in Marie again and ask you, because I mean, currently you're working for UN Women, and you've worked for other parts of the UN too. In the work that you've been doing, and now with UN Women, how is UN Women doing any work in its peace and security work to try to influence, armed forces, NATO, and military on the ground?
Yes, thank you, Gro. This is a very interesting conversation. If you might have read the last SG report on women, peace and security, that shows on funding that this year global military expenditure reached 1.9 trillion, which is the largest annual increase in a decade. And at the same time, the share of aid dedicated to programs or projects focusing primarily on improving gender equality and women's rights has decreased to 4.5%. So these, I think, terrifying figures kind of show the disconnect between, what we are pushing for, UN Women and many other different organizations, and the reality on the ground. And going back to military forces, even countries, as you rightly mentioned, like Norway, that are leading the agenda in the international scene, have their own challenges to walk the talk and to mainstream gender within their own forces. And this is the case, of course, sadly, in much bigger proportion in other countries. And so UN Women does do some work to promote different policies and ensure that military forces take into consideration the resolutions on women, peace and security. But we're also doing it within the UN with peacekeeping operations, for instance. It is very challenging to ensure that peacekeeping operations, which are composed by troops, soldiers, that are provided by two contributing countries, sometimes they do not have necessarily proper training on gender equality. They have, as you know, many issues of sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers in country where they're deployed. So there is still, unfortunately, many challenges, and so we need to keep pushing for the agenda worldwide, but also within our organizations. And this is also the case for youth, peace and security. Within the UN, it is an organization that just celebrated its 75th anniversary, and it's still a very hierarchical organization, still man-led. So of course there are many different progress, and UN Women is leading in this sense, but it remains extremely challenging, and it's a fight that needs to be continued, because we also see, unfortunately, some setbacks in this agenda.
Thank you. And just to follow up, Marie, because I know you were in Haiti for UNDP, and I mean during the earthquake in 2010, 2010, um, one of the things that we saw and what was reported, and at that time I was working for UNIFEM, now UN Women, and I was in New York, and one of the things that was reported back was that young girls, because there was a lack of food, a lack of just basics, and those who came in as peacekeepers and humanitarian workers actually were perpetrators, trading sex for food with these young girls. So back to the youth, peace, and security agenda, it gets complicated if those who come in to help are the ones who are the abusers.
Yes, so you're perfectly right. Fortunately enough, this is not the norm and remains exceptions. But this is also why the Secretary General called for this zero tolerance policy, because this is unacceptable. And we know that in times of crisis, conflict, or natural disaster, the level of sexual harassment, domestic violence, and abuse is tremendously rising. And we see it now with the COVID-19 pandemic. The level of domestic violence at home is not a safe place anymore for many, many women around the world. And this is the case in France, where I'm from, in the US, in Nordic countries, in the global South. It's not based on, conflict affected countries only, but in terms of stress and crisis, we see the level of sexual and gender-based violence dramatically rising. And you're perfectly right. In Haiti, right after the earthquake in 2010, it was really traumatizing to see these instances of people coming to help committing violence or abuse. But I also had the chance to carry out a study in the border area between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, specifically on gender and human security. And right after the earthquake, most of the aid was coming from the Dominican Republic, which is a neighboring country, because the airport was closed. And trucks charged with aid were stuck at one point at the border because of administrative and diplomatic issues between the two countries. And 3 days later, all these trucks with their drivers stuck at the border, you had, unfortunately, tens and tens of reports of young girls trading food or money for sex to these drivers that were bringing aid to the country. So these are realities that we cannot turn a blind eye on, and that we need to be aware of that and find systematic ways of countering it. And unfortunately, it is not going to stop. So it needs continuous action, continuous attention, and this is really the call of the UN and the Secretary General in his last WPS report that he just presented in the Security Council, that 20 years on, he said, our impact is not limited to statements and resolutions. We have done progress, but the progress has been too slow, and I quote, too narrow, with setbacks and easy to reverse. And this, I think, when you look at politics in the US and elsewhere in the world, we know that progress can be easy to reverse, and we need to be cautious and of that.
Hopefully, we're learning from some of what is happening, and what I was referring to in Haiti is 10 years back, and the resolution on youth, peace, and security came in 2015, and a lot of strength and momentum has been built on that in the time that has passed. And I want to, with that, go back to Ingrid, because I mean, you have in-depth knowledge of what's been going on in Bosnia. And if we look at the women, at the youth, peace, and security agenda, with the resolution coming in 2015, there's actually a war child organization that was established after 2015 that now gives some of that visibility. And I know that you've been in contact with them and know how they've been struggling.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. We actually tried to have some of them represented here today, but that failed, unfortunately. But this is an interesting group of children who were conceived, like I said, some through war rapes, some by soldiers, foreign soldiers, and others in Bosnia, and they unite across ethnic lines. They talk about common concerns, and they want to be a voice also against sort of the ethnical divisions in Bosnia. So they are a very positive force within the country for that reason. But they also reach out to other countries and children born of war in other contexts, such as, like I said, Rwanda and the Congo and so on, or DRC. So you know, it shows that given some support, given a platform, being courageous and having a voice is very important. But I'd like to pick up, if I may,
Please.
pick up on something that Lena was talking about also, because I think that at this time of thinking about, okay, so 20 years have passed, what has happened? And we are at a point where the agenda is in a way under attack also. Our foreign minister addressed it this morning also about how she was thinking about working with this agenda when Norway takes up a non-permanent seat in the Security Council. And I think we need to acknowledge that the agenda has a profoundly normative ambition, which is not just to make things better out there in the world, and Lena pointed to it. We need to make changes at home, even in the so-called gender superpower of Norway. So not all is well here either. And I think this very high and very valuable and important ambition, now that it meets pushback, especially through we have the theme of violent extremism that we may talk about later, but also groups who see this agenda as their enemy. And how do we address that? That is a big question. And it will be very interesting to follow how the Norwegian foreign minister will pick this up. But this is a very big challenge.
And I think that's a cue to Andrea, because I was thinking, you know, the agenda under threat and being made difficult. Next year is 5 years since the peace accord in Colombia. And, you know, signing is just one part. Implementation is the hard part. So, you know, is the peace accord in Colombia under threat?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we have a president who campaigned, saying he was going to dismantle the whole peace agreement. So just like the resolution, the Women, Peace and Security, and also the Youth, Peace and Security agenda, these are excellent starting points. They're very important for the normative ambitions and to lay a groundwork to build consensus, of course. But then implementing it, that is where we, of course, struggle putting this into practice. And the Colombian peace agreement is definitely no exception to this. We see that, as I mentioned, yes, the youth are mobilizing massively, but we face a backlash. And that backlash is so violent and murderous that only this far, only in 2020, and this is during pandemic and lockdown and everything, we have more than 251 social leaders. So that's activists, human rights, lawyers and journalists and all sorts of grassroots activists that have been killed just for their support to implement the peace accord. Sometimes it's something as simple as a local community, an indigenous or peasant or a campesino community that really want some of those agreements, those promises made in the peace agreement, not only by the government, also by former FARC rebels who have also been killed, 52 ex-FARC combatants. So demobilize those who have laid down their weapons and said, yes, we will now go into civil life. They're being killed for doing so. For doing so, of course, we're facing a huge backlash and we're extremely concerned. We're talking about over 71 massacres this year only. We are frightened, and I think that is the whole point, to scare this youth that grew up with ideas of hope and democracy and peace. So we are then being attacked for those beliefs, for trying to build something better together. And yet, what at least I find extremely inspiring, what keeps us going here in Norway, is certainly that the strength and courage that we see from women, from indigenous women, from young peers all over the country in Colombia, really pushing hard for this peace accord to be implemented in its full sense.
Thank you. It leads me on to, I mean, Marie was saying early on that youth have not previously been included and have been seen as more of a problem with unemployment, with unrest, with a lot of issues. With frustration in Colombia, that might be the same, where youth might get so frustrated that they go to other measures than being a positive part of a peace movement. And that leads me back to you again, Inger, because currently you're doing research on extremism. And I mean, first of all, it would be interesting to hear something about that. And also, if there's any gendered perspectives that you see in the current research that you're doing.
Absolutely. This agenda has also emerged as part of, or violent extremism has emerged as part of the focus of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Also, we've seen that in the recent resolutions. We've seen it in the global study and so on. And what we see is a little bit puzzling, let's say, because we see that one narrative, which has to do with how should we combat or prevent violent extremism or counter violent extremism, well, then women are brought up as possible agents of resistance and change. But in that story about that possibility, we kind of cast women in very traditional roles. So that they are seen as kind of agents of resistance because they are mothers, homemakers in their community, not necessarily as political leaders and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure how to address it, but it is puzzling that while the Women, Peace and Security agenda wants to change in a way gender dynamics in ways to counter violent extremism, plays on traditional gender dynamics. So here is an inconsistency somehow. And I have a good colleague at PRIO, Jenny Lorentzen, who's written about this in Mali, and she argues that we might actually be making also women security actors in their own homes and communities because they are seen as these points of giving or providing counter narratives to sort of terrorist ideological aims. So this is one complex that we see. This was perhaps very academic, but it's something that is not fully in sync, to put it like that. But then I think that also we have, if we look at the far right and gender dynamics of the far right, I don't think we've grasped exactly the dynamics of that to its fullest just yet. We've been very focused on other kinds of violent extremism. So we see now women, gender being part of also the ideology of the far right. We see women leadership in the far right. We see ways in which they play on both traditional gender norms based on ideals of the Second World War, if you like, but also ideals of gender equality as a way of saying that in the European context, we adopt gender equality, but the others are, more traditional and different, and creates a dynamic there. So this is riddled with complexities that are very hard to address. So as an academic, it's a lot to work with. If I were in a different sphere of work, it would be much more difficult to handle. So I think there are some challenges for us also for the coming years.
And I also think that, the discussion and research you're doing on extremism also ties into another part of this, which is the whole anti-gender discussion and the anti-gender movement. And I see both Marie and Lena nodding to me. Marie, I know that, the peace and security work that you do at UN Women, do you also look at that? And I know your director, Pumzilam has spoken about this, but is it also connected that the work you do on peace and security, looking at how the anti-gender movement is influencing the agenda?
Yes, well, I was nodding because it's true that this anti-gender movement is hitting everywhere and in national and international context. I think sometimes, working in the gender field, you kind of you get surrounded by like-minded people. So you have the impression of a progress that is not reflective of their reality on the ground. And in some cases, when you go outside of the Women, Peace and Security section and go to even UN colleagues working on real peace and security issues, then gender becomes, a soft issue. Yes, inclusion is good, but let me focus now on what really matters. And we also see that on youth, peace and security, and I think it's also an issue. So we've been working very hard. UN Women is pushing for that, but when I was working at PBSO as well, the Peace Building Support Office, to really emphasize the synergies between youth peace and security and women peace and security, showing that these are two inclusion agenda. It's about including demographic groups that have been historically excluded from decision making, while they're in many cases the primary people affected by what's going on. It was really interesting to hear Andrea talk about the Colombian situation, where young people have been living in times of war and they just want to have peace, and yet they mobilize and yet they are excluded from formal decision-making processes. And in these two agendas, I also feel that sometimes there is how to say that, there is a fear that bringing up new agendas, talking about difference and discrimination, talking about intersectionalities, can shift away attention from gender and women, peace and security. We've been working for 20 years and still we know all the challenges that remain. So sometimes there is a little bit of fear that bringing up, youth, peace and security, it's new, it's fashion in a sense, so it will bring more attention, bring more resources, and we really need to counter these fears and show that it's just talking about the intersectionality of discrimination. When we give space for women, we know that only 6% of signatories of peace agreements are women. How old are these women? We don't have the data, first of all, but I can say without being wrong for sure that a tiny proportion of these 6% are below the age of 30, and maybe it's 0. When you look at women in parliament, in decision making, only 25% of worldwide parliamentarians are women. If you look at young women, women parliamentarians below the age of 30 years old, do you know how much is it? It's 0.9% of the worldwide share of parliamentarians. So we understand very well that in that sense, young women, they face double discrimination. They're, sidelined because they are women. They are sidelined because they're young. But if they're also Black or Indigenous or lesbian, or you can just add in the list. And these women are just not heard. Their voice is not elevated and not reflected. So it's critical to really understand these inclusion agendas as add-ons and as one big effort rather than silos.
Thank you, Marie. And I think the way you frame this also goes back to the title of this discussion, which is that it's an intergenerational and having a perspective that goes across. So it's an intersectional, which mean we had a prime minister in Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and she says everything's connected with everything. And I think that shows that if you want to get things done, you have to see that everything is connected with everything. And, as part of the anti-gender discussion, I'm also wondering, because extremism can be defined by many people as different things. So, in the work that you do, you will probably also see that, some women working for gender equality and women's rights to decide over their own bodies and to be part of discussion will by some be defined as extremists.
Well, you have the whole term femonationalism, which in a way encompasses that, which is extreme views, but based on a notion of gender equality as a core value of particularly, let's say, European values in opposition to other groups, and then very often immigrant groups. And you see these forces building up, may not all be violent, but definitely some or many on the far right that use the language and some of the intentions of the Women, Peace and Security normative framework to promote a very different kind of politics. And this is a puzzle.
And confusing. And I think it is on purpose that they are doing this to confuse people. In Colombia, they had, as part of the referendum in 2016 on the peace agreement, whether or not the people wanted to accept this agreement that the parties had reached, the government and the FARC guerrilla, the far right went on this crusade against the ideology of gender. That's how they named it. The ideology of gender. And that was horrible, and it's going to end the classic family constellation, and it's going to install, if you vote yes for this peace agreement, then you are for a Castro Chavist gay dictatorship. And I think it really is meant to confuse the ordinary citizens who are, increasingly paying attention to news, who have access to much more information than before. And not everyone is trained well to critically, assess the sources that they find online and in their WhatsApp groups and elsewhere. So I don't know, I see it as a tactic. I see it as a very purposeful attack on the work that has been done and the whole foundations of the Women, Peace and Security agenda.
Besides that, I've always wondered what a gay dictatorship is, beside a notion or a threat to scare someone. But Lena, you've been sitting, listening to this in Vienna, and I know that among a lot of work you've done, you've also been traveling around. And I know you've been to Colombia several times also doing trainings. How do you in those trainings also talk about, the Women, Peace and Security agenda being under threat and possibly also the anti-gender movement in this?
Well, sort of. I talk about a lot of my research and to, how can I say, military personnel in all of these countries that I've been to. And the funny thing is that they recognize it within their own forces. What we struggle with in the Norwegian armed forces, you see them smiling, you see them nodding. They recognize, the culture that is in a lot of armed forces across the globe. So I think that for many militaries, gender perspectives is kind of their competence blind spot. So they don't really know what they don't know. And sometimes that sort of not knowing about gender perspectives and presenting things as gender neutral, that like we're all soldiers, actually undermines it doesn't take away the gender differences that are actually there. So being gender neutral is not maybe the right way to go about it. But I really have to comment also on Andrea and talking about youth, because you inspire me. It's really fantastic to listen to you talk. And I have my own children, a little younger than you, but I mean, I'm optimistic about the future. Looking at the young people of today, they know so much more than I did at that age, and they are persistent and they want to fight the good fight. And I am hoping that young people today can actually help support the women, peace, and security agenda, because young people don't take shit like we've done for years. So I mean, we really need to listen to the young people's voices in this, and they are the future, and their perspective should definitely be part of the solution. And for the armed forces, I actually think it's easier for the armed forces to include young people, because they do not threaten, the hierarchical, how can I say, identity and roles and privileges the same way as talking about women and in the armed forces or gender perspectives. So I'm hopeful for the future that the young people is going to bring this agenda forward.
Thank you so much, Lena. And you're bringing me to a point. 1 hour runs by so quickly. And it's been so good to have you here. And I want to, before wrapping up, throwing out a question to where you, Lena, left off, talking about the future. We've come 20 years since Women, Peace, and Security and Resolution 1325 passed in the Security Council. What are your hopes for the future, Andrea?
So I think that we already have seen so many results. There are young women as heads of state, like Ardern in New Zealand, like Marine in Finland. These are very young, strong, capable women who, to me, and I think in many regards, we can see as part of this collective struggle that has been going on for 20 years, that we will continue to build upon, and where, as the tensions grow stronger, well, the struggle then will intensivate, and we will persist, and we will continue. And I think we have a very, very bright future ahead.
Marie, what are you hoping for the future, looking at where you're sitting now working for UN Women? What needs to be done?
Well, we need to continue the fight to ensure participation, meaningful participation beyond figures, but also to ensure the protection of those who fight on the ground. So the protection of women and young people, human rights defenders, activists, peace builders that are actually doing the work that inspire us and just make me want to wake up every day and continue working for this cause, because the young people, the women in the ground, are the ones who are taking risk for a more equal future. And I fully agree. There is a lot of hope. I can see in many countries, in France, my country, feminist isn't a bad word anymore. There is a young generation of young women that are convinced and that are moving. You can see what young people do for climate change. So there is a lot of hope, but we need to continue the work and definitely not take anything for granted.
So hope and not taking things for granted, Inger. Research-wise, where do we need to go?
Well, I think there are many themes, as we've touched upon today, that are open for more research, and I'm very hopeful that we will get more research. And I just want to echo also what has been said. Looking back, a lot has been achieved. But moving forward, as a professor at University of Oslo, I'm extremely encouraged by the fact that there are so many students who are interested in these themes, men and women, boys and girls. So I think 20 years down the road, when we celebrate again, we will have a lot more expertise on this field, and that is good for everyone.
And before I end this for today, I want to just pick up on the fact that tomorrow there is a webinar organized by PRIO where there will be a discussion on research and use of research, and also on how can researchers and civil society benefit from working together, and how have we benefited from working together in the years that have passed and during these 20 years. So tune in again. And with that, I just want to first of all say thank you so much to Marie, to Lena, and to Andrea and Inger, who've been with me here on stage. It's been a good discussion for a good hour, to be continued, and many more discussions to come. I think what keeps us alive is having discussions and exploring areas where we actually need to do things. And I'm also happy that we could end this on a positive note with a lot of enthusiasm and positive thinking for the future. So thank you for joining us, and keep discussions going.